Europe, the world's most infamous colonial power. Africa is the victim of colonial ambitions. The British Empire previously claimed Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Nigeria, South Africa, and many more territories. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and other regions ceded sovereignty to France. Germany had its own regions known as German Southwest Africa, German East Africa, the Cameroons, and Togoland. Italy claimed Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia as its territories. The Portuguese captured Angola, Mozambique, and Cabota. Their Spanish neighbors took Western Sahara and Spanish Morocco, while Belgium seized the Congo, and this is how the ownership of the African continent was divided. Only Liberia and Ethiopia were still free and independent of European domination in 1914. However, only a short time ago, Europeans had seized approximately 10% of the African countries. That is before the race for Africa. The 16th century saw the beginning of European colonization of the African continent. Portugal would begin early by claiming their new positions over a century before the Dutch. The Dutch would do the same in South Africa, resulting in a thriving community at Cape of Good Hope. By the end of the 18th century, France's Napoleon had his sights set on the later British controlled Egypt, and a few decades later, the British would take aim at the Dutch Cape of Good Hope. Liberia would soon become home to newly freed African American slaves who had received American authority to establish their own colony. The following decade saw a steady stream of European colonists flocking to African areas, each with high dreams and goals on behalf of their own countries. France seized Algeria and moved on. Britain continued its attempts to wrangle South Africa. Germany finally entered the race as Otto von Bismarck sought to establish his country's credibility as an imperial power alongside the others, and further interests from other European nations eventually led to the Berlin Conference, with tensions rising amongst European nations competing for power and control in their new-found playground. Leopold II of Belgium sought to capitalize on the chaos in order to expand his rule beyond his humble holdings of Belgium. Leopold established the Congo Free State and told his European neighbors that he was a devoted humanitarian who just wanted to help the people of Central Africa through abolitionism and additional humanitarian aid, and that this new free state would be a place of rights and liberty for its citizens. This was precisely the opposite of what Leopold would actually do, and he had known all along that his objectives were far more evil than what he told his peers. His leadership over Congo was ruthless, and the surrounding European conquerors ultimately caught on his imperial strategy. They reacted by attempting to force Leopold out of Central Africa by rapidly expanding their own territories around him and around each other, but this sent each of them into a downward spiral, rapidly approaching a collision with one another. In order to avoid an all-out conflict in Africa or even at home, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck summoned his foes to a summit. The Berlin meeting would begin on November 15, 1884, and extended until February 26, 1885. The meeting, which included no representatives of any African country, had one principal goal: to divide Africa and pass over its territory to Europeans. This was accomplished first by cementing European nations' existing claims on the continent, and then by providing the groundwork for how the remaining area could be acquired by a European state. A clear approach was established. However, this was done entirely without the participation of local African communities. Nonetheless, once a European power sent explorers to a specific African country, treaties were written up and signed between the Europeans and local authorities, usually in European languages that the African chiefs did not understand. The treaties pledged to provide European protection to these locals, but this was far from the truth. After returning to their homelands, the explorers would have their treaties recognized by the local government first, before taking the agreement to the rest of the European powers at the Berlin Conference to negotiate acknowledgement for their newfound claim. After the pact was signed by all the imperial powers, the annexation of the African land became official. Thus, with the help of the regulation set at the Berlin Conference, the race for Africa continued until the early 20th century, when the world's attention turned to a new problem, the First World War. The official timeline for the scramble is typically put from 1870 to 1914. But why did this occur? In general, Europeans regarded their African counterparts as culturally, racially, and intellectually inferior, implying that explorers and government officials saw Africa as free real estate and that the locals were incapable of forming their own independent, functioning states. There is no single reason, but a multitude of factors appear to have combined to drive European powers to act with such haste and disrespect for indigenous peoples. Europeans saw taking all of Africa as morally justifiable, especially after discovering new resources like coffee, sugar, and rubber that could be extracted through local labor. These discoveries were made through exploration, which Europeans had been doing for a long time, often driven by each empire's expansionist ideas. This was especially difficult to begin in Africa, thanks in part to fatal infections, Western Africa in particular, and the nickname of White Man's Grave. Due to the prevalence of deadly diseases such as malaria and yellow fever there, in the 1700s, 9 out of every 10 colonists sent to Africa by the Royal African Company died prematurely, with 6 of those 9 failing to survive even a year. It wasn't until quinine was discovered in the bark of cinchona tree that the Europeans had a hope of surviving malaria. Yellow fever remained a menace, but quinine put an end to the malaria genocide, which was critical given the European nations' undeniable desire to expand their territory and influence outside of their own continent. It was nearly hard to end the imperial age, and without a cure, many lives would have been sacrificed for the cause. However, it's safe to suppose that the invention led to further exploration and colonization. The post-World War era saw the decolonization of Africa, reversing the Scramble's achievements. Today, Africans have their freedom, yet there are still some disturbing footprints left behind from a very recent history.